So, what happens when the world's biggest economic engine just stops? Today, we are digging into the story of the Great Depression. This wasn't just a crisis that broke the bank. No, this is the story of how it broke the entire world.
This wasn't a scene from some dystopian movie. This was real life for millions of people in the 1930s. America, the famous land of opportunity, had turned into a land of breadlines and just completely broken dreams. A free cup of coffee? That wasn't a nice little morning pick-me-up. For so many, it was literally a lifeline. I mean, it's a terrifying thought, isn't it? The wealthiest, most powerful nation in the world, brought completely to its knees. How does a collapse that huge even happen? What were the warning signs that pretty much everyone seemed to miss? Well, let's get into it. Okay, so to really understand the crash, we have to go back in time. We gotta talk about the party that came right before it. The 1920s in America, they weren't just roaring. They were like a full-on economic supernova. It was all fueled by amazing new technology, super easy money, and this unshakable belief that the good times were just never going to end. You see, before World War I, the British Empire was pretty much the big boss of the global economy, but the war, it completely flipped the script. While Europe was busy fighting, America was busy selling. The US became the world's go-to spot for, well, everything, from food to weapons. By the time the war was over, America wasn't just a rising star anymore. It was the world's brand new financial heavyweight, lending money back to its old rivals. And this number says it all. In just 4 years, the value of what America was selling to the world almost tripled. The US was the world's workshop, and man, business was booming. All this new money created this wave of optimism that just swept across the country. Things like cars, radios, and telephones, they weren't luxuries anymore. They were the new must-haves. And the best part, you didn't even need the cash up front. Banks were practically throwing money at people, and buy now, pay later became the new American dream. The stock market was absolutely on fire, and everybody wanted in. People were literally betting their homes on the idea that this party would never, ever stop. But you know how it goes. Every party has a last call. And in 1929, the music didn't just fade out. It came to a screeching, grinding halt, leaving the whole world with a hangover of truly epic proportions. So here's where we start to see the first cracks in the foundation. American factories were just churning out goods at an incredible speed, but there was a huge problem nobody wanted to look at. People couldn't actually afford to buy all this new stuff. Wages for the average worker just weren't keeping up, and that created this really dangerous imbalance of way too much supply and not nearly enough demand. And then the folks in charge decided to try and cool things down a bit. The U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, raised interest rates. Think of it like this. They basically just jacked up the price of borrowing money. All of a sudden, those super easy loans weren't so easy to get anymore. The credit that was fueling the party started to dry up, and the economy began to sputter. And then, the dam just broke. On a day they called Black Thursday, the stock market took a massive nosedive. Panic set in, and investors just started dumping their stocks as fast as they could. 5 days later, on Black Tuesday, the market didn't just fall, it completely imploded. The party was officially brutally over. $14 billion. That's how much wealth just vanished in a single day. Fortunes that took years, sometimes generations to build, were gone in a flash. The nation's confidence was just shattered, and the Great Depression had begun. But here's the thing. This wasn't just America's problem to deal with. The U.S. economy was the engine for the entire world, and when that engine seized up, it took everyone else down with it. It was like a global domino effect, just one thing after another. First, the U.S. market crashes. Then, American banks, desperate for cash, start calling in their loans. They demanded their money back from all these European nations. Then, to protect their own struggling industries, countries started slapping these huge taxes on imported goods. They're called tariffs. Well, that brought international trade to a dead stop. And the result? European economies, completely cut off from American money and unable to trade, just collapsed. The numbers from this time are they're hard to even wrap your head around. In the United States, 1 out of every 4 people was out of a job. 1 in 4. In Germany, 6 million people were unemployed. Global trade got cut almost in half, and back in the US, over 11,000 banks failed, taking people's life savings right down with them. And this wasn't just about numbers on a page. I mean, behind every one of those stats are real people, real families. In America, people who lost their homes ended up living in these shanty towns they bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles.
In Britain, the panic led to a run on the banks, where terrified people just rushed to pull all their money out at once, which caused even healthy banks to fail. And in Germany, all this economic chaos, it paved the way for the rise of some truly scary extremist parties. So the world was on its knees. How did it get back up? How do you even begin to recover from something like this? And what were the lasting changes from this decade of pure devastation? In the US, a new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, he stepped in with a really bold plan, the New Deal. It was this massive government effort to get people back to work, to get the banks under control, and just to give the country a much-needed shot of hope. You had programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, putting millions of young guys to work on public projects, building the national parks and infrastructure we still use today. It was a pretty radical idea for the time, but it was a start. Now, the New Deal was definitely a lifeline, but it wasn't the cure. And here's the hard truth. What ultimately ended the Great Depression wasn't a government program. It was another world war. The absolutely massive industrial production needed for World War II was the jolt of adrenaline the global economy needed to restart. At the same time, the old financial system was crumbling. Britain abandoned the gold standard, this system where money was tied to a fixed amount of gold, and that move gave them a lot more flexibility to fight the downturn. Pretty soon, other countries did the same. The economic devastation of the Depression also had a really dark political side effect. In countries like Germany, it created this opening for extremist ideologies to take hold. As our source material points out, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party preyed on people's desperation. They offered simple scapegoats and promised a return to national glory. The Great Depression didn't just cause economic hardship, it literally helped set the stage for the Second World War. So, the world that came out of the Great Depression was a fundamentally different place. Government suddenly had a much bigger role to play in the economy. The US was now the undisputed global superpower, and the old financial rules, like the gold standard, they were basically a thing of the past. This crisis didn't just change the world, it completely remade it from the ground up. A decade of ruin that completely reshaped our world. It's such a powerful lesson in just how fragile our economic systems can be, and how terrifyingly fast things can fall apart. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, have we really learned that lesson? Or are we maybe destined to repeat some of the same mistakes?